How to create Claude projects. When you open Claude, you'll see there are some Claude project templates that Anthropic have provided, such as study project and research project. These built-in projects could be useful for your students. They just need to click on the tile, and then they'll be taken through a few steps to populate the project with instructions and files. But if you want to create your own custom projects, first you need to go to the projects section in the left-hand panel. Here you'll see all the projects that you've already created and also any projects that have been shared with you. To create a new project, go to the New Project button at the top right. Give your new project a name and a description. The project name and description won't affect anything about how Claude behaves in the project. They're purely there to help you or the people you share the project with understand what the project is for and how they should use it. Next, click Create Project, and you'll see a screen like this. If you're on a slightly smaller screen, the chat box may fill the full width of the screen and the instructions will actually be down at the bottom, so you'll need to scroll down. The next step is to add some custom instructions for your project. So click the plus button in the instructions field, and then type your instructions into this box. You'll see some example text showing the kinds of things you could include in your instructions. And you can also add tools at this point. So if you click on Add Tools, there are 3 tools you can turn on to supplement how Claude works in the project. Web search, which means that if it doesn't have access to the knowledge you want in its training data, and currently its training data was cut off at the beginning of 2025, so it doesn't know anything beyond that point. You can turn on web search so it can look for more up-to-date information on the internet. You can also turn on deep research, and this is quite an interesting feature if you are using Claude to try and find out about a new topic, because it will actually spawn several different versions of Claude, and it will have one kind of controlling Claude language model that gives each of the other versions of Claude a task. This can be useful if you're setting up a research project and you want Claude to go away and look for sources on the internet, and it can spend up to 15, 20 minutes at a time collating sources, only sources that it has access to. So anything behind a subscription or a login or a paywall won't be available to it. And you can also turn on extended thinking. So this just means that Claude will spend longer producing a plan before it actually gives you the response. So in some cases, for complicated topics, this can improve the quality of its responses. But in most cases, it will just slow down the responses, so it's not necessary to have it on. Once you're happy with the tools, or if you don't want to add any tools, you can click Save. So I've added a simple instruction now, which is quiz the user about Claude projects. And I want it to only pull information from the project files, which I'll upload in a moment. And that's because I know about this particular topic, large language models will actually often give incorrect information because their training data might be out of date. For Claude, it cuts off in early 2025. There have been several changes to Claude projects since then. Or I know information on the internet is actually often incorrect. So I want it to only use correct information that I provide in its questions. So I'm going to save my instructions. And next, I'm going to add some files to the project. So as you can see, I can add PDFs, documents, or text. So I've dragged in some PDFs, which are just some slides and some worksheets that I use with my colleague, Darren Moon, for a session about Claude projects that we run for the Eden Center. And the idea is that after the session, people could maybe use this project to quiz themselves about the content of the session to make sure they actually understood the workshop and they're happy to go away and apply the knowledge actively for their own use cases. So let's just see how it works. So every chat now in this project will follow the project instructions and it will pull information from the project files. So I'm going to say hello. So you can see that even though I've given it a very generic greeting, which is just hello, it's following the general project instructions, which are to create a quiz about Claude projects based solely on the information from the project files. So it's reviewed the documents it has access to, and now it's making a quiz. So it's asking me questions, what are Claude projects, and it's pulling information from the workshop materials. And you can see, because I was very vague in my instruction, I just asked for a quiz. It has just predicted the response with the most common format for a quiz, which is a multiple choice quiz. So this is why you may want to give more detail in your instructions, because I would say this probably isn't the best way for a large language model to deliver a quiz, because there's really no need for it to make multiple choice options, because one of the benefits of large language models is that you can just give free text answers and it can give you feedback. Whereas, with traditional tools, Mentimeter, Microsoft Forms, you are limited to more passive assessments of knowledge using multiple choice. And again, I probably would want it to only deliver one question at a time rather than this big, long spiel block of text. In terms of helping students with the cognitive load and helping people focus on one question at a time. So now that I've tested my instructions and I've seen what's actually happening, because I've left quite a lot to Claude's own interpretation, I'm actually going to go back to my project instructions now and tweak those instructions to try and improve how it behaves. So if I click on example, I can go back to the project and I can click on the pencil to edit the instructions. And I'm just going to add a new line in now based on my experience with how Claude was behaving. So I'm going to say, only ask one question at a time and wait for the user's response. And also, I don't want it to do multiple choice options. I want them to be free text responses with feedback. So I've said, don't provide multiple choice options. Questions should elicit free text responses, and you should provide feedback and adapt the subsequent questions based on the user's answer. So I'm going to save the instructions. And let's go back to the chat now and see, even with the same greeting, which is just hello, how it's going to respond differently now that we've updated those instructions. So we can see that it's now explaining what it's going to do. So it's going to quiz me about Claude Projects. It's going to ask me one question at a time and provide feedback. And we can see there it is, just asking me one question. So I'll just give it a quick answer and then see how it behaves following on from that. So the question was, what is the purpose of the project instructions field when you're setting up a project? And I've responded that the purpose is to tell Claude how to behave in every chat that users have in the project. And you can see it's now giving me some feedback, saying that I gave a good answer, and it's basing this on the information from the files, the project files, which are the slides and the worksheets that I provided. And I can see it's actually pulling direct quotes from the files. So in the workshop, one of the benefits I say that Claude projects have over kind of general large language models is that we can make sure people have an equitable experience, because if you set up a project, everyone uses the same project, then individual students who are perhaps good at prompting have less of an advantage over people who are less familiar with AI. So it's giving me some feedback on my answer, and then it's giving me the next question. I could actually decide at this point that I want to tweak the instructions again, because rather than giving me comprehensive feedback, I may want it to ask me to kind of extend or develop my answer a bit further. But hopefully you can see how when you're creating your project instructions, the best approach is to start simple, test how it works, and then iterate and add in new information to the project instructions based on how Claude is behaving and how you want it to behave. For this example, it's quite a simple activity. I'm just asking it to quiz people based on the files. So quite simple instructions are probably all we need here. If you are interested in making more complicated learning activities, sometimes you do need to spend a bit longer on drafting your instructions. And often I would start my instructions in a separate text editor rather than just trying to write them directly into this small instructions field in Claude. We also have some guidance about how you can approach writing more structured prompts or instructions for Claude. So this is an instructions guide and instructions builder, and it's actually a Claude artifact, which we have some separate videos about. So in the instructions guide tab, it just explains how it works, and it goes through some components which are commonly seen to help improve or control the behavior of large language models. There are lots of different ways you can actually write prompts, and you'll see lots of different structures for good prompts. This is just one structure that I think works well for particularly coming up with learning activities. So you can see you've got role, goal, and context. Click on one of the components and it'll drop down with some examples. And then because we're looking at learning activities, it has this component which is kind of guidance for feedback. So how do you want the LLM to give feedback? Do you want it to base it solely on a model answer so you can ensure that it's correct? Or do you want to perhaps provide some rubrics or tips or general advice for things to look for in a good answer? Not all of these components are necessary in every prompt. We saw in the first example, prompts can be quite simple. These are just some things you may want to consider adding. In the instructions builder tab, it's quite simple. It's just some text boxes where you can actually write in your prompt and add information from each section. And then if you want to see the examples, you can just click the drop-down box, and that might be useful for you to create your own prompts. Once you're finished, you can click copy all instructions and they'll be copied to your clipboard if you've actually written anything in. We've also shared these artifacts for the kind of example projects that we set up, which explain what the purpose of each project is and what the instructions demonstrate. So here is how you can, for example, get a large language model to deliver specific messages, which may include links verbatim and some other things. And if you scroll down, you can see they all follow that structure we looked at in the prompt builder. So you can actually click on the components to see the specific prompt. So you could use these as a starting point for your own project instructions for Claude. If you click copy all instructions, you could go away to a text editor and manually adapt them. Or you could go to Claude and say, please help me adapt these instructions to my own teaching context. And it will ask you questions to gather information and then adapt the prompt for you. Finally, we've made this Claude project instructions writing assistant. And as I create example project instructions, I'm adding them to the project files here. So it's got some examples to work from, and it's got some instructions here, which is telling Claude its goal is to help educators at LSE write instructions for Claude projects. So let's just see how it works. So we can see that it's been instructed to help people set up Claude projects for learning activities in particular. So the examples here are all about learning activities. They're not kind of general productivity use cases. It's got a link to that Claude project instructions guide we looked at. It explains the workflow it's going to go through. So it's going to ask you questions to gather information about the different components of good prompts, and then it will write the prompt for you. And it also has the tip that writing good instructions or prompts is often a process of trial and error. So after it gives you the kind of first draft of the prompt, you should probably go away and test it and refine it either yourself by making changes manually or just coming back to your chat and saying, Claude is doing this, I don't want it to do this, how can I change it? And ask this project to refine the instructions for you. I'm just going to say I'm ready to start. And then it'll start going through the workflow that we've described. So we're starting off gathering information about the role, goal, and context. So what's your teaching context? What do you want this project to do? What's the purpose of the project? It's kind of drawing from the example project. So it will suggest those types of use cases as examples, but you could also try just explaining that you want to do something completely different and seeing how helpful it will be at that. So I'm just saying I want to create a role play. And now it's giving me the next question. So you can see we're still in the role, goal, and context, but it's asking me what character Claude should play in the role play. Again, who the students are and what the learning goal is, because I didn't answer that in the previous round. If I'd answered that, it would already have that information. And what is the topic and scenario it should focus on. So it'll go through the different steps until it's got information that it needs to create a good prompt for you. So I'll put the links to the artifacts into the video description, and you can actually just access those directly if you have a Claude LSE account. Unfortunately, projects do work a little bit differently, and there's a separate video I've made about sharing Claude projects, but you do actually need to add people directly to the project. So if you do want to be added to the writing assistant, please just email me, and I'll put my email in the video and in the description. And then I will add you to this project. And then if you have any feedback or tips about how it could be more helpful, I'll be very happy to receive them. If you're already using Claude Projects or something similar in your teaching, we'd love to hear about your experience. So I'll share a link to this Microsoft form in the video description, where you can contribute to our new AI in Education exchange, which is a way for educators to share their practice and experience related to AI with each other.